It was supposed to be a routine day on a quiet city street, but it turned into a moment no one would forget. An elderly black man, dressed simply and moving slowly with a cane, walked down the sidewalk, minding his own business. His weathered face carried years of wisdom and untold stories. But to one police officer, patrolling in his squad car, he saw something else entirely. The officer, a man known for his quick temper and questionable behavior, stopped his car abruptly. He stepped out, his posture tense, and began questioning the elderly man. His voice carried suspicion, his words laced with disrespect. Passers-by watched, some recording the interaction on their phones, sensing that something was deeply wrong. Despite the officer's hostility, the elderly man remained calm, his steady gaze betraying nothing but quiet dignity. He didn't argue, didn't raise his voice, but there was something in his calm demeanor that made even the officer pause for a second. But what happens next would shock everyone, including the officer. This wasn't just any man, and as the truth unfolded, it would leave the officer questioning everything about his own actions. Stay tuned to find out who this man really is and how this encounter changes everything. The officer crossed his arms, sizing up the man in front of him. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone sharp. The elderly man tilted his head slightly, as if deciding how much to say. "Just taking a walk. Is that a crime now?" he replied calmly, his voice steady but firm. This only seemed to irritate the officer more. "Don't get smart with me," the officer snapped, stepping closer. The man didn't flinch, even as the officer's presence loomed over him. People on the sidewalk murmured nervously. Some kept walking, but others lingered, uneasy about what might happen next. The man's composure was unnerving, like he'd been in situations far more intense than this before. "Do you live around here?" the officer pressed, his hand hovering near his radio. The man's face remained calm, but his eyes flickered, just for a moment, with something, disappointment, sadness. Whatever it was, it passed quickly. "Officer," the man said slowly, his voice carrying an unexpected weight, "you might want to think carefully before you go any further." The officer froze, caught off guard. What could this old man possibly mean by that? The tension in the air thickened, and the crowd's curiosity grew. Who was this man, and why wasn't he afraid? The officer narrowed his eyes, his pride refusing to let him back down. "Think carefully. Are you threatening me?" His voice was louder now, drawing more attention from bystanders. The elderly man sighed deeply, shaking his head. "No, officer. Just giving you a piece of advice, but I see you're not the kind to take it." The officer ignored the man's words, reaching for his notepad. "Let's see some ID," he demanded. The man slowly reached into his coat pocket, his movements deliberate to avoid alarming the already agitated officer. As he pulled out a well-worn wallet, the officer snatched it from his hands. His eyes scanned the ID quickly, but something about the name made him pause. He frowned, then glanced back up at the man, as if trying to place him. Meanwhile, whispers rippled through the small crowd. A younger woman leaned toward her friend, her phone still recording. "He looks familiar," she murmured. Another person chimed in, "Isn't that?" But no one finished the thought, unsure of what they were witnessing. The officer, still oblivious to the murmurs, handed the ID back roughly. "I don't care who you are," he said, doubling down. "You've got no business loitering around here." The elderly man raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "No business, huh? You're sure about that?" His voice was low, but there was something about the way he said it that stopped the officer cold. Somewhere deep inside, the officer felt a crack in his confidence, but he wasn't ready to admit it, not yet. The truth, however, was closing in fast. The officer's patience was wearing thin, and it showed in the way his jaw tightened and his hand hovered near his belt. "You think this is a game?" he barked, stepping closer. "You need to leave before I make you." The elderly man didn't budge. Instead, he leaned slightly on his cane, his steady gaze locking onto the officer. By now, the crowd had grown larger. People whispered to each other, their curiosity turning into concern. The young woman with the phone whispered urgently to someone nearby. I know that name. He's someone important. Why doesn't that cop know who he's messing with? A friend nodded, their eyes darting between the two men. The officer glanced at the crowd, sensing their unease, but instead of backing off, it only fueled his need to assert control. This is your last warning, he said, his voice sharp and unyielding. But the man didn't flinch. Instead, he straightened up, his voice calm but firm. You've made a lot of assumptions about me today, officer, and maybe that's the problem. You don't see who's standing in front of you. Before the officer could respond, a man in a suit appeared from the other side of the street, moving quickly toward them. His face was pale, his expression urgent. The officer barely noticed him until he called out, "Wait, stop everything." The crowd turned to watch the newcomer, their whispers growing louder. The officer hesitated, his grip tightening on his belt. The elderly man didn't even turn to look. He stood there, calm and composed, as if he'd known all along that this moment was coming. The man in the suit hurried across the street, his voice growing more urgent. "Officer, step away from him. Right now." The officer turned, confused and annoyed. "Who are you, and why are you interfering?" he snapped, clearly unwilling to relinquish control. The man in the suit ignored the question and went straight to the elderly man. His demeanor shifted instantly, showing respect and a touch of nervousness. "Sir, I'm so sorry this is happening. We've been expecting you," he said, lowering his voice as if trying to contain the situation. The crowd fell silent, their curiosity boiling over. The officer's frustration boiled up. "What is going on here? Who is this guy?" he demanded, looking between the two men. The man in the suit turned, his face pale but composed. "You really don't know, do you?" he asked, his tone incredulous. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a card, handing it to the officer. The officer read the card, his expression shifting from irritation to disbelief. He glanced back at the elderly man, his face pale now too. This can't be right," he stammered, his voice barely audible. The elderly man finally spoke, his calm voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "It's not about who I am, officer. It's about the choices you made today. Now you'll have to live with them." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, another figure emerged from the crowd, a woman holding a badge. "Officer, we need to talk," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. The stakes had just risen, and the officer realized too late that this wasn't just about a simple interaction. He was in far deeper trouble than he had imagined, and the truth was closing in fast. The officer stared at the badge the woman held, his mind racing. "Internal Affairs," she said firmly. "We've been following your behavior for months. And now you've managed to embarrass yourself in front of the one person you should have recognized." The crowd gasped, their murmurs rising. The officer's face turned red, his eyes darting between the woman, the man in the suit, and the elderly man who still stood silent and composed. "What are you talking about?" the officer barked, his voice cracking. "Who is this guy?" The woman from Internal Affairs raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "That man," she said, pointing to the elderly figure, "is Judge Nathaniel Carter, a retired federal judge and one of the most respected civil rights advocates in the country." The crowd froze, their whispers turning into shocked exclamations. The officer's face drained of color, his bravado collapsing. Judge Carter finally spoke, his voice calm but cutting. "You saw me as a threat today, officer, not as a person. That's a failure of your badge, your training, and your judgment." His words landed like blows, leaving the officer visibly shaken. But just as the tension seemed to peak, Judge Carter turned toward the crowd. "This moment isn't just about me," he said, his voice carrying a new strength. "It's about what we tolerate and how we hold people accountable. Change doesn't happen without accountability." The woman from Internal Affairs stepped forward. "Officer, hand me your badge. You're suspended pending investigation." The officer's hands trembled as he reluctantly obeyed, his career unraveling before the crowd's eyes. As the officer was escorted away, Judge Carter adjusted his coat and turned to leave, but not before pausing to meet the eyes of a young man recording everything. "Make sure the truth gets out," he said simply, a small smile breaking through his otherwise serious demeanor. The crowd watched in awe as he walked away, the weight of the moment sinking in. But as the young man uploaded the video, something unexpected happened. It went viral within hours, sparking not just outrage, but also a call for reforms. Judge Carter's quiet dignity had ignited a movement once again, proof that even in retirement, he was still a force for change. As the video spread, it became more than just a viral clip. It was a reminder of the power of accountability and respect. The officer's actions led to overdue consequences, while Judge Carter's grace under pressure inspired a wave of conversations about justice.